How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the most possessed podcast in the world. We're your host, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome back to another edition of our new series, The Genre Essentials, where we go over an entire genre and pick 12 albums from said genre and basically just talk about them. Just talk about why they're essential, how we feel about the albums, and basically just act as a gateway to getting into the genre that we are talking about. The first episode that we ever did on this was in experimental hip-hop, but as we mentioned the other day in the Death Worst to Best, we are going to be doing a new genre essentials on death metal. And the timing is perfect, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
And, with that in mind, obviously there was a load of albums that we considered putting into this list that didn't make the cut, so I just want to briefly mention a couple that we didn't put in. We didn't put in Pierce from Within by Suffocation, The Bleeding by Cannibal Corpse, and Those Once Loyal by Bolt Thrower. So, honourable mentions, get the clap.
Ooh, the infamous clap.
Oh yeah. So, to start off with... Alright, so basically how this works is we're just going to go through each album, just talk about why we think they're essential, and just our own thoughts and opinions, obviously. We have 12 records here, and we're going to start off in the mid-80s, in 1985, with the 1985 debut album from the California death and thrash metal band Possessed, entitled Seven Churches, and it's the album that's often credited as being the first proper death metal album. You know, there's a debate to be had when it comes to what the first actual death metal album was, as, you know, the discourse around this album especially is calling into question whether it's more of a thrash metal album realistically. And while I agree that Seven Churches is more of a thrash record, I pretty much still think it has elements and traits that would later define death metal as a sound and as a genre. You know, I'd say it's essential on that merit alone, since the blueprints for bands like Morbid Angel, Cannibal Corpse, and many others would follow are on this album. You know, it pretty much contains the trademark guttural vocal style, the abrupt changes into different tempos, the fast drums and blast beats, and the down-tuned, distorted guitars that we all see in death metal. You know, Seven Churches isn't properly there yet, but it exceeded what was then one of the heaviest styles in thrash metal by pushing the boundaries of extreme music forward. But when it comes to my enjoyment of the album, I find myself respecting it more than I actually enjoy it, honestly. I do like elements of it. I like how raw the overall production and sound of this album is. I love the very dissonant riffs and the rough guitar tones, and there's absolutely some killer tracks to its name, which I will get into. You know, but what holds Seven Churches back for me is the execution of the whole album, especially on the instrumental front. I get the whole chaotic nature of the record is, you know, a lot of the appeal, and I totally get behind a lot of the chaotic shit that's on this album, but I just feel like some of the abrupt change-ups and drumming are incredibly sloppy and executed poorly. You know, there's a batch of tracks in this album that I only really see as memorable or stand out, but among a few that just aren't. You know, like I said, it's a decent record all in all, and I absolutely respect it as a piece that establishes death metal as a style and a sound. I just think the overall album experience is fine for what it is. It may grow on me, but we'll see.
Yeah, you know, like you said, this album was, you know, to say fundamental to the formation of death metal would be an understatement. And so, no matter what I think of the record, you know, that alone is a reason to definitely respect the project and, you know, appreciate what it did for the genre and for music at large. You know, and as you said, you know, genres don't just appear out of nowhere, and death metal is no exception, as this is evidently, you know, very influenced by thrash metal. In fact, I would say that this is equal parts thrash metal and death metal. Like, a lot of the instrumentals here are just straight up just thrash. You know, the genre is definitely still in its infancy stages here, which means you don't really get the experience from this album as you would from, you know, even the next few albums as we progress even a few years into the genre's formation. However, I still think that this album is awesome. I still, you know, really love the explosive instrumental work. I love how, you know, when I look at it as a thrash album by thrash standards, it's very much dark, it's very nihilistic, and, you know, I definitely appreciate those two styles merging, especially considering there was not much like it when this came out. You know, as I said, the genre was still in its infancy, and, you know, the vocals especially, I think, complement the music very well. I do kind of get where you're coming from, and, you know, I don't think this is a perfect project by any means. And I do think that the genre would quite obviously, progress very, very far from where this project is in just the next few years. But for what it is, it's an important album, and I myself personally still very much enjoy it.
Fair enough. I can respect it for being the formation of the genre anyway. And my favorite tracks from Seven Churches are Holy Hell, Twisted Minds, Death Metal, Seven Churches, and Burning in Hell. My least favorite track is The Exorcist.
My favorite tracks are The Exorcist, Burning in Hell, Evil Warriors, Seven Churches, Satan's Curse, and Holy Hell. My least favorite track is Twisted Minds. Alright, next up we have Altars of Madness by Morbid Angel. It was released in 1989 through Combat Records, and it's also one of the major albums that had an influence on death metal and helped progress the genre. It's also considered one of the pioneering albums in the genre, and all in all, it's a fucking badass project. While Seven Churches still very much held onto, those thrash metal roots, I think that Altars of Madness is around the time, obviously Death came before it with Scream Bloody Gore, but spoiler alert, there's going to be another Death album on the list. Yeah, but you can see in just those short, 4 years, the genre had already come so far. It already had been established as its own genre. I don't think calling this thrash in any way, shape, or form is fair. I think this is a pure, just unfiltered death metal project, and it's just incredible. It's definitely instrumental to the genre's history and all that, but, when we're looking just at the music purely, this album has aged just incredibly well. The instrumentation is apocalyptic, it's powerful, it's very dynamic and monstrous. The driving guitar riffs, transitions are just absolutely chaotic here. Sometimes even anxiety inducing. The guitar solos are just seamlessly interworked into the music, and, the drum and bass work throughout remain consistently thorough, tight, and raw. It's just a really, really well crafted metal record, and David Vincent's vocals are some of the most satisfying and raw and dark yet melodic I've ever heard in death metal. His energy, his presence is just, it's definitely the driving force behind a lot of the music. Overall, it's one of the best death metal albums, I'd say. It's definitely the best of the 80s. It's definitely the best of the, we'll call it the foundational years of death metal. But yeah, it's an album that has stood the test of time, and just like Seven Churches, has been incredibly influential to everything that would come after in the genre.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like you said, Morbid Angel were another one of those bands that were very seminal to the death metal scene and the genre's formation, as they were, around the very early stages of death metal. And, death metal enthusiasts always, froth at the mouth over this band's absolute best records. And one of them, of course, is what we're talking about now, Altars of Madness. And it's pretty easy to see why Altars of Madness is held in high regard in the field of old school death metal, because it's genuinely such a fucking incredible album. Altars of Madness is just death metal in its purest form. It's got everything you'd expect from a death metal album, but it sounds as potent and as hellish as I'd imagine that it would have sounded like in 1989. Much like a lot of early death metal albums, Altars of Madness does take influence from thrash and heavy metal, but unlike some of the early stuff, I feel like Morbid Angel gave the sound its own identity and personality. In turn, that led to the band, setting conventions that satanic death metal would be known for, and after this record, a lot of bands would follow suit. So its influence is enough to make this an essential record, but another reason why it's essential to me, because it's simply a fucking incredible album. Yes, the album may seem boilerplate and samey, especially for old school death metal standards, but at the same time, I could give two shits when the production, instrumentation, and overall songs are as fantastic as they are on this album. I love the blistering production, I love the incredibly dissonant and aggressive death metal riffage. The thrash parts can still be heard, but they feel distinctly death metal to me. The solos are frantic and absolutely killer. The drumming is excellent. It's uncompromisingly relentless and feels so crucial to this record's charm. The constant switch-ups and change-ups are done effortlessly and executed incredibly well, and the guttural vocals are just fucking great. The satanic themes and lyrics we see all over this album were very much important and revolutionary for the sound, and while I don't go to death metal for the lyricism a lot of the time, I appreciate it for adding a blatant sentiment that would be used as a bit of a trope thereafter. This shit is just such an adrenaline rush of an album. When I first heard it, and the more I've come back to it, the more I love it. The riffs are amazing, the drumming is amazing, this album is just amazing. I absolutely love it. It's easily one of my favorites on the list, and it's definitely, I agree with you saying, it's definitely the best death metal album of the 80s, I would say. Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Altars of Madness are Immortal Rites, Suffocation, Visions from the Dark Side, Maze of Torment, Bleed for the Devil, Damnation, and Evil Spells. I don't have any least favorite tracks.
My favorite tracks are Immortal Rites, Visions from the Dark Side, Maze of Torment, incredible track. Chapel of Ghouls, Bleed for the Devil. If I had to pick a least favorite, I'd go for Damnation.
Okay, moving on, we have Left Hand Path by Entombed, which came out in 1990. This is the debut album from the Swedish band Entombed, and, Left Hand Path doesn't completely reinvent the wheel fundamentally when it comes to death metal. It did manage to define and carve out a sound that felt totally unique to the sound of Swedish death metal with its guitar tones, and even after all these years, it still holds up incredibly well to me. For its contributions to the regional sound of Swedish death metal, it totally deserves to be noted as an essential album in death metal, but it also deserves to be an essential to me because it's simply a pretty great album in my opinion. It has some serious quality on it. For one, the legendary buzzsaw guitar tones on this album are amazing. I love how beefy they sound all throughout this record. They're really fuzzy yet powerful sounding. They absolutely rip, and it's only complemented further by the excellent production on this record. The overall sound is really nasty and visceral. There's so much power behind the sound, and despite some moments where the drums sounded a bit too dry for my liking, it mostly culminates into a really gritty and intense yet enjoyable sound. I also have to mention that this album is slightly more dynamic than your run-of-the-mill death metal album, but it may also seem like that because, it picks up influences that feel kind of doom-inspired and kind of progressive-inspired. I really think that sound is culminated well on this record, and it's pretty damn great whenever it appears. The musicianship is great throughout this album. It's nothing totally technical, but it's very tight and well performed. The dissonant riffage is great. The solos on this album are fantastic. I love how wild they are. The late L.G. Petrov's guttural yet decipherable vocals sound gritty and work well with the overall sound. And despite its very one-dimensional nature and the fact that some tracks kind of blend together, it's a very consistent album that has some really great cuts to its name. This Entombed record is, very unrelenting. It's very much an essential to my ears, and I just want to mention that the album art would be amazing if they just didn't use fucking papyrus.
I think I'll keep on the theme of the album art. I think this album is best described by, the atmosphere portrayed on the cover. Very dark, very nocturnal, winding, and very, very, cryptic almost. But at the same time, it still has the power, the intensity that, you get with a death metal album. And this project certainly did a large part in putting Sweden and Scandinavia as a whole on the death metal map, similarly to how Bathory did the same with black metal. And, we know today how prominent Scandinavia is in terms of metal bands. This album is intense. It's definitely a lot more dynamic, a lot more, I'd say a lot more eclectic in a way. You mentioned influences on or by doom metal.
Death and doom.
Yeah, progressive metal. You definitely hear a lot more of that here. I think this project definitely has a little more to offer than just being a straight up death metal project, which I definitely do appreciate. The distortion of the music is fantastic. The sheer darkness of the music, sets an atmosphere that is unlike anything else at the time, in my opinion. I think this album is just produced fantastically as well, and just like Morbid Angel, it has not aged a day, in my opinion. The guitars create an absolute wall of just haunted noise. The drums hammer away at your psyche throughout, and L.G. Petrov's vocals, his vocal work here is outstanding. I think he definitely serves the atmosphere of this project perfectly with his voice. Rest in peace, man.
Rest in peace.
Yeah, all in all, it's an essential for a reason. I think it does some cool new things with the genre, and it definitely pushes it, further, just like a lot of these early albums do. And yeah, it's definitely a classic.
Yep. My favorite tracks from Left Hand Path are Left Hand Path, The Truth Beyond, Drowned, Bitter Loss, Morbid Devourment, and Abnormally Deceased. My least favorite track is But Life Goes On.
My favorite tracks are Left Hand Path, Drowned, Revel in Flesh, When Life Has Ceased, But Life Goes On, Bitter Loss, and The Truth Beyond. My least favorite track is Supposed to Rot. Alright, up next we have Dayside, their self-titled debut album. It was released on June 25th, 1990 by Roadrunner Records. And, there's something to this self-titled project that, more so than any other death metal album we've talked about up to this point, it just puts me in an absolute state of just unease, and in a good way, for sure. It sounds absolutely cursed. It just sounds absolutely infernal. It sounds like it came from the depths of hell, straight up. I think there's a lot to appreciate about this record. I think it absolutely nails what it's going for. But on the flip side, I do have one pretty major gripe with the project. I think that the production is absolutely horrific, and not in a good way. The drums and, especially the drums, they just completely overpower, and, they just don't seem mixed very well. The guitars sometimes sound, a little too overpowering. It's like one song the drums are overpowering, one time the guitar is overpowering. Nothing seems to be mixed very well. Everything seems to be very thin in the mix as well. And it is a little distracting, but I don't think it's distracting enough to take away the enjoyment I get from this record, straight up. And I guess you could say it does add a little bit of darkness and a charm to the project, which I guess is valid. But it definitely was something that was in the back of my mind throughout my listening experience with this project. However, I do think that the dark atmosphere of this album still remains intact. And, the things that I do love about this project, the instrumentation is fantastic. It's raw, it's very in your face, and just very infernal. I think that still shines even throughout my my distaste for the production. And overall, I still think it's a very good album. It just definitely has one major flaw, in my opinion.
Yeah, Dayside are one of those bands that weren't exactly pushing the boundaries of what death metal could do sonically or instrumentally, since, bands like Death, Morbid Angel, Entombed, and Atheist were around before them, but they were a band that were pushing death metal into an area that was very over the top and adding more of a ridiculous and unapologetically brutal edge to the death metal sound. Personally, I prefer the album that follows up Dayside's self-titled Legion. It's definitely way more refined than this one. But of course, since we, chose this one, let's just get into it. In a lot of ways, Dayside pretty much embodies all the conventions that were set for old school death metal, but the band pretty much mastered what they were doing, hence why so much of this album is great to me. But, the personality of this album is just very over the top. It's unapologetically over the top. Glenn Benton's vocals especially, and, the Hoffman's ridiculous, and it's just utterly ridiculous guitar work at times. It's so chaotic. I love it. The production on Dayside, I agree, it is very rough around the edges. At times it's just very jarring, but honestly, I like the sound of this album, even though it does seem a little thin and a bit muddy. The music itself is just fun, so I don't care. Obviously, the music isn't anything stupid, crazy, or technical, but it's just ridiculously chaotic and off the wall. The drumming is hilariously frantic, I love it. The dissonant guitar work is savage, and Glenn Benton's demonic vocals are great to me and work well with the ridiculous and over-the-top sound. There's plenty of great riffs and wild solos throughout this album's duration, and it's pretty consistent to me. The tracklist itself has so many great highlights to its name, despite not really being anything technical or dynamic. It still rips, and the very blatant and immediate sound is incredibly enjoyable from front to back. It's just some good old satanic death metal that goes the fuck off, and I'd recommend it as an essential. But obviously, I definitely recommend the one that came after this one, Legion, a bit more. You do definitely like it a lot more. It's definitely better produced than this one, I'd say.
I have to check that out, honestly. I didn't dive deeper into their... I just headbutted my mic, apologies. I didn't dive really deeper into their discography, but yeah, if it's better produced, then for sure, yeah, I'll give it a shot.
Oh, it is. It's much more refined, trust.
That was really my only gripe here, honestly.
Yeah, okay. My favourite tracks from Dayside are Lunatics of God's Creation, Sacrificial Suicide, Dayside, Day of Darkness, and Crucifixation, I mean. My least favourite track is Mephistopheles.
My favourite tracks are Lunatic of God's Creation, Sacrificial Suicide, Oblivious to Evil, Dead by Dawn, Dayside, Mephistopheles, and my least favorite track is Day of Darkness.
Alright, we're moving on to the next record, which is Mental Funeral by Autopsy. This is the sophomore album from the California band Autopsy, and this is a record that's also considered a big classic in the world of old school death metal. And while it's not a perfect record by any means, it's still got some really interesting elements that make it stand out as a cohesive record in early death metal, and to me, it stood the test of time in numerous aspects. For one, the only real issue that I have with the album is the vocals from Chris Reifert. He's not a bad vocalist by any means, and he matches the vibe of the very eerie and heavy instrumentals, but his vocal style is just very much stereotypical for death metal vocals, and, there's not really much personality behind them, in my opinion. Outside of that, there's a lot to admire about Mental Funeral. For one, Autopsy bring forth a sound that crosses over death metal with the sounds of doom metal in its purest form, and in turn, that leads to some sounds and dynamics that are just really unusual and sinister and pretty eerie. These blends are mixed together in a very tasteful and creative way. Plus, the quality of the instrumentals really speak for themselves. The guitar work all over this thing is really great. I love the leads and riffs all over this thing, and the raw production makes the sound incredibly gritty and filthy. There's also some really great bass lines all over this thing, which I will always appreciate, and I love how colourful and dynamic the instrumentation can be all over this album. It's a very short album at over 30 minutes, and during its runtime, it packs a lot of punch with what it attempts to do, and generally speaking, it's really creative. It's creative for its time, and I love a lot of the great ideas and instrumentation that's under its name. The vocals are the only real letdown on Mental Funeral, but even then, I can see myself getting a bit attached to this album with more listens for its creativity alone. It has some fantastic tracks under its name, and yeah, I'd say it's essential.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. As we get through this video, we definitely see the genre of death metal progress, and a few sub-genres kind of popping up here and there, and this is the first really pure example we get of death doom metal, and doom is also just the perfect descriptor for this project. I think the atmosphere of this project is just hopeless. It sounds like a bleak and barren wasteland of just suffering and despair translated into music. The instrumentals are also just performed with such raw angst and aggression. It isn't all in your face and punchy, and I think it relies a little more on just the intensity and the haziness and the sheer rawness of the project to deliver its anger and deliver its angst across. Vocally, just like you said, it's not my favorite death metal album, but I still think they do the job, and it's not a case where it's distracting me and it's taking away any of my enjoyment. It's just not really adding towards my enjoyment. Overall, it's a solid record, and I definitely do respect its place as a classic among death metal projects. But for me, it's good, but it's not the best.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Mental Funeral are Destined to Fester, Torn from the Womb, Slaughter Day, Robbing the Grave, Hole in the Head, and Dark Crusade. My least favourite track is Dead.
My favourite tracks are Twisted Massive Burnt Decay, In the Grip of Winter, Torn from the Womb, Slaughter Day, Dead, and Robbing the Grave. My least favourite track is Hole in the Head. Okay, next up we have Unquestionable Presence by Atheist. This is the second album by death metal band Atheist. It was released in 1991, and it was an absolutely massive landmark in expanding the musical palette of death metal, as it blends technical death metal with the likes of prog metal and even jazz fusion. And the experience I get listening to this project is unlike any other death metal album, because labeling this as just a death metal album is selling it very short. It's one of the most eclectic and ambitious albums the genre has to offer, especially considering this was still in the early years of death metal somewhat. It has so much to offer, each track presenting the listener with just very winding song structures, incredibly tight and mind-blowing instrumental work, and, as I said, influences from the likes of prog rock or jazz fusion. I think that the clear highlight of this project is simply the insane complexity and musicianship present here. Everything from the guitar solos to the constant chaotic yet completely on point drumming completely blow me away. It's an incredibly performed album, and it's probably one of the best performed albums in the genre. One gripe that I do have are that the vocals admittedly did grow on me, but on first listen, they felt a little hit or miss. I do like them, but there's times where the instrumentals are a little more progressive and a little more abstract, and a little less raw and heavy, and the vocals do at those points sound a little overbearing. But honestly, that happens like twice on the album, and it's something that I have gotten used to with consecutive listens, and I don't really get distracted by, or it doesn't really take away from my enjoyment. And overall, I think this project is incredible, and I think it definitely was a landmark project in death metal's early years, and it just did so much new it brought so much new to the genre. It was just a breath of fresh air, and it's seamlessly like combines its very eclectic influences into one very cohesive piece, and it's a fantastic album.
Yeah, I hugely agree that it's a landmark in the death metal sound. Around this time, bands like Death were pretty much breaking ground with the more technical and progressive aspect to the death metal sound, but another early example of tech death and prog blending together is with this very band Atheist, who pretty much took the sound into an even more wild, creative, and technical territory. The band's prowess and creativity would best be exemplified with this record here, and it's an unquestionable essential on our list, I'd say. Which while I much prefer a lot of the other proggy tech death bands from the time, like the aforementioned Death, Atheist managed to put a really interesting spin on this sound with influences that stem from not only death metal and prog, but also from jazz and thrash metal. And for lack of better words, this album is fucking bonkers, to be honest. And generally speaking, it's just really great. Instrumentally, Atheist are fucking nuts all over this thing. Every bit of instrumentation on this album just sounds so precise, meticulous, nuanced, and full of depth, while at the same time it just sounds so wild, chaotic, and off the wall. The influences that the band expand on are nothing short of fantastic, and the ideas presented go over really damn well. And for its time, it just feels so unique with its blatant jazz fusions that go over incredibly well. The riffs and the solos are insane, the bass lines are just so addicting and catchy, and the drumming is just so precise and tight all throughout. The death metal vocals applied do come off a little goofy at times, to be fair, I will agree with you there. But not to the point where it kind of ruins the songs for me. The songs themselves at the core are just really great and consistently exciting. There's rarely a moment that will leave you bored on this thing, and all thanks to the killer instrumentation and pretty much everything that's on this record. So yeah, this fucks. Listen to it. It's essential. And sure. My favorite tracks on Unquestionable Presence are the title track, Your Life's Retribution, Enthralled in Essence, and The Formative Years. My least favorite track is Brains.
My favorite tracks are Mother, Unquestionable Presence, Your Life's Retribution, Enthralled in Essence, An Incarnation's Dream, and The Formative Years. My least favorite track is also Brains.
Okay, we're moving on to the next album. We have Heartwork by Carcass. This is the third studio album from the Liverpool death metal and gore grind band Carcass, and Heartwork is the band's most well-known and inventive records. Heartworks was a moment where death metal came full circle with where its influences stemmed from and ended up expanding upon said influences. Despite me not being too crazy about the album as a whole, I wholeheartedly respect what the band did with Heartwork. Death metal was heavily inspired by the sounds of thrash and heavy metal in its infancy, but instead, death metal pretty much made the riffs and overall guitar work sound very dissonant and lacking melody. But with Heartwork, Carcass essentially gave way to more melodic riffage and extreme metal, and pretty much defined what we now know as melodic death metal. It's not just in the riffage and overall guitar work that Carcass set in stone thereafter, but also in the production style that feels much more clean and pristine in contrast with a lot of the raw and brutal edge of records previously. The mix is very beefy and really balanced in the mix, and I can respect it, but I suppose that a lot of the production is the reason why Heartwork doesn't fully click with me, since it feels like something is missing when it comes to a lot of the tracks themselves in the mix. Outside of that though, Heartwork has some really good aspects to it. For one, the guitar work sounds great and the riffs are really creative at points, the bass lines are really sick throughout this thing, and the overall compositions are really good. Not to mention, there's some really fucking sick tracks to its name, which I will get to. I wish I could get into it a little bit more, and, I do actually enjoy it, but I don't think it's, amazing or anything that I would probably go back to on a regular basis. I respect it a lot. I think it's a good album, and it's essential for on the merit that it's incredibly inventive and influential for the genre, I'd say.
Man, you fucking nailed it. Holy shit. Yeah, it certainly, the project definitely does bring some fantastic stuff to the table in terms of just the raw death metal sound, and it definitely perfectly portrays the more melodic side of death metal. And as you said, you know, huge respect to this project for pushing the genre in that direction. However, it's probably my least favorite of the albums we're going to be covering today. I still very much enjoy it, but it just comes down to the fact that some of the tracks here just simply don't really click with me. They don't really strike me as particularly memorable. The riffs here are definitely hit or miss. Some of them are absolutely exhilarating, particularly the more melodic ones, but some just sound like, you know, a thrash metal riff I've heard 100 times over. It just doesn't strike me as anything truly groundbreaking at times, whereas at times I think, you know, it definitely does have that to it. It just has too many moments that don't personally click with me, but however, there are still moments of absolute magic on here. You know, some moments that absolutely blow me away, some moments that completely push the genre in a new direction. And, you know, it's still, I definitely understand why this is considered a classic, and I wouldn't deny that it is, you know, for its influence and for those reasons. But personally, just too many moments that just don't really click with me.
I absolutely agree. You nailed it too. Okay, so my favourite tracks on Heartwork are Carnal Forge, Heartwork, and Death Certificate. My least favourite tracks are This Mortal Coil and Our Beat Mocked Fleesh. I hope I pronounced that right.
Yeah. My favourite tracks are Buried Dreams, Carnal Forge, Heartwork, Embodiment, Mortal Coil, and Death Certificate. My least favourite tracks are Blind, Bleeding the Blind, and Doctrinal Expletives. Oh
shit!
You know. Next up is Death Symbolic. It's the 6th studio album by American death metal band. American death metal legend Death, released on March 21st, 1995 by Roadrunner Records. I don't know if this album needs any introduction. It's possibly the most acclaimed death metal album of all time, and is it for good reason? Yep, it is. It's in my opinion the greatest feat in Death's already impeccable discography, and it's one of the greatest feats in death metal history, period. By the time Symbolic came around in 1995, you know, Death were already a household name in the genre, and, you know, we talked about bands like Morbid Angel or Possessed, who helped push the genre further. We did not talk about Death, even though they were very much, you know, in that sphere and very much pushing the genre further as well, because we were reserving the Death album to be this one, and we finally get to talk about Death. They are, in my opinion, from what I've heard, just the most groundbreaking band in the genre. They just took it to new heights with every single release, and, you know, Symbolic definitely feels like the culmination of everything they did throughout their career. It's the band's magnum opus, and an album that takes the best parts of everything they've released in the past and just puts them together into just a perfect mix of, you know, technical death metal, progressive metal. It has some melodic death metal. It's just got everything there. It's an incredibly cohesive and dense album, and, you know, it's, in a way, it's one of the most beautiful culminations of all the, you know, the dark tropes of death metal. It all comes together to create something that is just so powerful that it becomes very emotionally potent. You know, it's one of the best death metal albums of all time. It's, in my opinion, the best death metal album of all time. It's probably my favorite metal album of all time. I already said that. In the death metal, the Death Worst to Best released. By the time this video comes out, it'll be released, so you should check that out. Yeah, it's an album that blows me away, and it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible.
Fucking hell, man. It's about time that we got to talk about Death. Realistically, any one of their albums could have ended up on our list, but we went ahead and chose the big boy, Symbolic. Now, to me, Symbolic was everything that Death were building up to from one of their previous albums, Spiritual Healing. It's where the band mastered the very technical and slightly progressive aspects of their music, and as a result, they ended up creating a fucking masterpiece of extreme metal. Now, the band's lineup on the previous album, apart from Gene Hoglan, pretty much bailed on Chuck, but, you know, with the help of guitarist Bobby Colby, and bassist Kelly Conlon, he managed to piece together, such a mind-bending album experience that quite honestly ascends beyond the boundaries of death metal, and it's all the better when the songs featured on this album are just consistently as amazing as they are on here. Like, come on, most of the songs on this album are peak metal. I shit you not. Like, the songs in Symbolic are clearly going for something bigger. They feel way more lengthy, way more dynamic, way more melodic, and way more progressive. And to me, they all pay off as we get some of the best and most consistent material that has ever come out under the death name and under the death metal genre. The production on Symbolic is fantastic. It has the right amount of punch, and the mixes are just so pristine. The compositions just feel so nuanced and incredibly meticulous. That's insane. The attention to detail and the precise musicianship is just mind-blowing to me, and it never fails to blow me away every time I listen to this thing. Symbolic easily has some of Chuck Schuldiner best vocal performances and songwriting on any death record. He sounds incredible, and just the very introspective and just honestly just quite beautiful lyricism from Chuck is just amazing. It's pretty much one of the most emotive and kind of powerful death metal records in terms of songwriting, I'd say. It kind of goes without saying, but instrumentally, Death just kick ass on this album. Symbolic is amazing when it comes to riffs, solos, drumming, bass work, everything. It's just fucking nuts. The more atmospheric and progressive elements of Symbolic are done incredibly well, and the lengthier passages, are near perfection to me. This album, obviously, I think it's Death's absolute best record. It's definitely my favorite on this list. It's probably my favorite death metal album of all time. It's not quite there for my favorite metal album of all time. I cannot do that to Rain and Blood just yet, but who knows? Who knows? And just Chuck Schuldiner is honestly just one of the greatest death metal artists of all time in death, and honestly just such a groundbreaking and influential person. So rest in peace to Chuck Schuldiner.
Rest in peace,
you legend. Symbolic is amazing. If you want to make any album on this your go-to, listen to this one first.
Yeah.
If you're not going chronologically, listen to this one first. I beg. It's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And with that in mind, my favorite tracks on Symbolic are Symbolic, Zero Tolerance, Empty Words, 1000 Eyes, Without Judgment, Crystal Mountain, Misanthrope, and Perennial Quest. Every track. No least favorites.
Yeah, same as you.
Okay, next we have... is it me next? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, next we have None So Vile by Cryptopsy. I hope I'm saying that band name right. Because I've every time I've tried to rehearse this with notes, I keep getting fucking mixed up with my words. Now, this is the sophomore album from the Swedish tech death and brutal death metal band, and None So Vile is a big record for this band. It's considered the band's main classic and one of the best brutal death metal albums of all time, and it's easy to see why that's the case, since this album is just so damn raw, technical, and brutal from front to back, and there's some really impressive shit on here. Plus, the way that it fused tech death and brutal death metal and how the band influenced the scene in the 90s is honestly enough to get a spot on this list, I'd say. But personally, this album doesn't really blow me away that often throughout its runtime. I feel like the band's ideas are a little limited as it goes on. It absolutely has some great ideas, tracks, and instrumentation throughout. It's very raw yet muddy production, does the very dark and chaotic sound justice. The technical chaos displayed throughout this album is really great in my opinion, and it for sure has some absolutely fantastic cuts. Lord Worm's vocals are kind of hilarious at times, and I cannot unhear the Scooby-Doo thing after reading what RYM was saying. But I suppose he works well with the overall presentation and instrumentation. Like I said earlier, it loses me as it goes on with a lot of its ideas and very uniform sound. It kind of loses its substance and blends together, but I respect what the album does overall, even though I don't love it. It's a good album, mind you, and I definitely recommend it, hence why it's here on this list. It's worth your time, but it doesn't blow me away, personally.
I definitely kind of felt like that at first, but this album has definitely grown on me throughout the last 2 weeks even. I think this may just be the most brutal and absolutely horrifying experience I've had listening to death metal. Everything about this album, the instrumentation, the vocals, are just completely demonic. The instrumental work, however, is I think what really makes this project special. Every track is performed with this, infernal and overwhelmingly manic energy. And, such unfathomable precision that it just kind of takes away any human aspects of this project and just make it sound like some sort of manic, robotic, just demonic entity. It gives the album like a very dystopian and mechanical feel, and I think that absolutely serves it justice. And this project is just an adrenaline rush throughout my entire body. It's just the drumming in particular. I do have to kind of go off course a little bit. The drumming is some of the best I've ever heard on a metal project. It is so on point at every single second. There's not a beat off point. It does not sound human. It just sounds robotic and mechanical, and I mean that in the best way possible. But overall, I definitely do enjoy this project a lot. It definitely did grow on me, and it goes for something very dark, very twisted, and I think it achieves that perfectly.
Who knows? It might grow on me a little as well. I only listened to it once, mind you, so who knows?
Yeah.
Okay, so my favourite tracks from None So Vile are Phobophile, Crown of Horns, Slit Your Guts, Grave of Fathers, and Orgiastic Disembowelment. And my least favourite track is Benedictine Convulsions.
My favourite tracks are Crown of Horns, Slit Your Guts, Graves of the Fathers, Dead and Dripping, and Phobophile. My least favourite track is Lish Mistress. Okay, up next we have Obscura by Gorgotz. This is the third full-length album by Canadian death metal band Gorgotz, released on June 23rd, June 23rd, 1998, through Olympic Records, which no longer exists.
Go to bed, man.
This is, again, one of the most ambitious. I know I said this about Atheist, but I'm saying this again. This album is incredibly ambitious for a death metal project, and it's probably the most idiosyncratic project we've talked about today. It completely threw away any expectations that I had of death metal, and just carves out its own identity and travels in its own individual direction for its entire duration. It's so complex, it's so incredibly dissonant, and I think the best way to describe it is like death metal meets math rock. Like, the song structures here just make no sense, but they come together so perfectly and so seamlessly. It's so winding, so powerful, and just so suffocating that there's really nothing out there that I've heard that resembles the death metal sound that Gorgotz assembled on Obscura. It's one of the best projects on this list. It's one of the most just exhilarating and just mind-blowing death metal albums I've ever heard. It's so weird. It's just so unlike anything else. I don't think I can really do this album justice by describing it with words. It's just something you have to listen to and experience. It's an absolute essential in death metal, alone for the fact that it just does so much unique stuff and brings such a unique sound to the table within the technical death metal genre. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Obscura has to be one of the fucking weirdest albums I've had to cover in this segment of the podcast. Like, it's easily the most avant-garde and strange album that we have of anything on this list. And even after listening to it like 3 times after my initial listens, I'm still even processing what the fuck is even on this album. It's like, this is probably gonna like come off a little weird, but honestly, I think this album is death metal's answer to something like fucking Trout Mask Replica or something like that. This album is just absolutely worthy of being labelled as an essential out of anything on this list, since it's easily one of the most experimental and avant-garde albums that I've ever heard in the death metal field. And despite how incredibly strange the music is on this album, I have to say I just loved it on first listen, and I love it even more with each consecutive listen. It's far from what you typically expect from the very straightforward, aggressive, and brutal sound of death metal. Hell, it's even so far removed from what you typically find on a tech death or progressive metal release. Like, Obscura is its own tortured beast, and it goes far beyond what the genre set out to achieve initially. Instrumentally and compositionally, Obscura is just so dense and mind-boggling. The riffs and song structures are just so technical, brutal, intense, and incredibly jarring, but it all culminates in such a beautifully bizarre way, and I just love how unique and odd this album feels. It's truly death metal without the tropes that often corner some bands in creatively, and the murky dissonance of the album is easily, like, just such a treat. There's so many good bass parts in this album, there's so many ugly yet technical riffs, the manic drumming is insane, the weird song structures are fantastic. I love Luc Lemay's very tortured sounding vocals, and the abnormal yet brutal presentation of this album is generally fantastic on every single track for me. The only real issue that I have for the album is it doesn't really need to be an hour long, and some tracks begin to blend towards the end. So on that merit, it's a pretty demanding listen. But honestly, none of those issues totally throw me off the album entirely, since I love everything on this album and every track fucking smacks. Now, I will say, be prepared before you go into this album, since it's very fucking demanding. But outside of that, I love this thing. It's worthy of being called an essential on our list. It's easily one of my favorites on here. And yeah, with that in mind, my favorite tracks are Earthly Love, Nostalgia. Wait a minute. When did you become an avant-garde death metal song?
You don't know anything about my past, man.
Holy fuck. Alright, so Earthly Love, Nostalgia, Obscura, The Carnal State, The Art of Somber Ecstasy, Clouded, Rapturous Grief, and Sweet Silence. My least favorite track is Faceless Ones.
My favorite tracks are Obscura, Earthly Love, The Carnal State, Nostalgia, The Art of Somber Ecstasy, Rapturous Grief, Illuminatus, and Faceless Ones. My least favorite track is Subtle Body.
Okay, we're moving on to the last two albums that we have on our list, and we're actually moving past the 90s. We're moving on to the year 2000, with the fourth studio album from the New York band Immolation, entitled Close to a World Below. And this album in particular is often regarded as this band's best and most acclaimed record. Now, for this list, there were a lot of bands that I never actually heard of or listened to prior, and Immolation was one of those said bands. And when going through this list, it was interesting to see how the genre was able to evolve and how said bands were able to put their own fresh takes on the sounds of death metal, whether that be Entombed, Atheist, Death, or Gorgotz. But with Immolation, their takes on death metal, at least from what I've heard in this album, very much stay true and blue to the core tropes of death metal. But on Close to a World Below, to me, it's a death metal album that tries to go for something much bigger in terms of sound and innovation. I remember seeing Pair of Jeans Reviews talk about this album a while back, and he mentioned how this album feels like it has elements that have a bit of a blackened atmosphere, and I can certainly agree with a lot of what he was saying on that merit, since a lot of this album just feels so atmospheric, large, and at the core just straight up evil. Now, what's cool on the surface level analysis of this album, let me rephrase that, sorry. Now, that's all cool on a surface level analysis of the album, but do I like this album? Fuck yeah, I do. It's honestly one of my favorites on the entire list, and for me, it manages to pack so much punch with only 8 tracks. To start, I think that the production on this album is fucking amazing. I love the way that the album sounds from front to back. It's very dense, it's very dissonant, its overall presentation is huge, it's chaotic, it's complex, it's technical, it's fucking hellish, and every track is just so killer. The riffs and solos are massive, and they just sound fantastic. The drumming and blast beats are so off the wall, energetic, and chaotic, yet so precise, and the technical undertones of the album add to the album's enjoyability, in my opinion. Ross Dolan's brutal vocals, while a little stereotypical, work well with the environment in this album, and the anti-religious songwriting, while isn't really setting a standard for death metal, don't really bother me, since this album just sounds killer from front to back. There's so many amazing tracks in this thing. I was pleasantly surprised by this album, and I was pretty enticed to go back and listen to more of Immolation's discography. For me, yeah, it's an essential death metal album, because simply it's just really fucking great. It's a killer sound all around. It's one of the best sounding on this list, in my opinion. It's simply just such a great technical album. The production is fantastic. It's easily one of the best produced on this list, and it's got quality to its name. So yeah, I'd definitely recommend.
Yeah, from one unique sounding album to another, I think Immolation's Close to a World Below brings on a very infernal and, disturbing sound to, what is already established in the death metal sphere. I think it captures an intensity and just a sheer darkness that I don't think many other death metal albums have managed before or since. And, the fiery inferno of a cover is, I think, a perfect atmosphere setter for this album. It's fiery. It just is so suffocating. It's overwhelming. It's just dense and just filled with hate, and it's absolutely spectacular. It's just as raw and punchy as it is just overwhelmingly atmospheric, and it's definitely a horrifying and terrifying experience, losing yourself in the very just dark and twisted soundscapes of this project, but it's one that's also very rewarding. I do have one little gripe with this project, and in my opinion, I think it does kind of slip into a little bit of a redundancy at the end. It does feel like by the time the last few tracks show up, it feels like the album has already played all its cards, and it doesn't really bring anything new. That's not to say the last few tracks are bad, but I just feel like I've already heard everything, a few tracks before the album ends. But I do think the rather brief length does stop this from becoming a serious issue, and it's just really me, grasping at straws. But overall, I mean, it's definitely an essential, I would say. It's definitely one of the most terrifying records in the genre I've heard. And, it's definitely a satisfying one to get into and appreciate. Yeah, definitely enjoyed it.
Alright. My favourite tracks from Close to a World Below is Father You're Not Father, Furthest from the Truth, Fall from a High Place, Lost Passion, Put My Hand in the Fire, and Close to a World Below. And my least favourite track is Higher Coward.
My favourite tracks are Father You're Not a Father, Furthest from the Truth, Unpardonable Sin, Lost Passion, and Close to a World Below. My least favourite track is Put My Hand in the Fire. And we're on to the last project, Mick. Ooh. I did kind of want to include a more recent project because the grand majority of this was just 90s projects, which understandably so, that was definitely the golden era of death metal. But we have an album from 2019, Mick. That's so recent.
Ooh, that's so recent. Oh my god.
Holy shit, man.
We skip forward. Holy fuck.
It's Blood Incantation, Hidden History of the Human Race. It's the second studio album by Denver death metal group, and it was released in 2019. Yeah. Death metal, on this project, death metal meets like spacey prog, and it's just an absolute spectacle of an album. It's very psychedelic, more so than anything else I've heard in the genre so far. It's an album that personally did not win me over on first listen, but after consecutive listens, it just keeps growing on me, and I just appreciate different aspects and different dynamics on this project more and more. And I feel like this project is very unique, even in today's standards, when the genre has already been doing so many things. Death metal's been around for like 30 years now. It's explored so many depths and so many ideas, and to get something truly fresh in the genre is definitely an achievement in of itself, and I think this project definitely achieves that. It definitely is one that I find myself enamored by, and the concept and the atmosphere of this project is just so grandiose and just so entertaining. It's got so much to offer. It's got technical and complex musicianship. It's got a very entrancing and, as I said, psychedelic, spacey atmosphere, and the vocals are just powerful, especially when mixed with the very epic and just grandiose instrumentation. It just delivers such a punch. And not to mention, the cover also is absolutely fantastic, man. It definitely has a cool aesthetic for death metal. It's not just trying to be fucking as terrifying or as horrifying as possible. It's a little more subtle, and it just even the details in the background are just so entertaining, and it's a fantastic cover. Music's fantastic too, and it's a great project to finish off the list.
Yeah, this Blood Incantation album here, like you said, is the most recent album on their list, and we're including this album because we've talked about a lot of older records from older bands, and it's a bit unfair that we leave out a lot of newer stuff from newer bands, but I feel like Blood Incantation really make a case to have an essential record in this list, since Hidden History of the Human Race is one of the most popular and acclaimed death metal records in recent memory, and even with that out of context here, this album here is genuinely exciting. It has some great ideas, exciting ambition, and quality to its name. Like, the only issue I have with this album is that the vocals aren't that impressive. Sure, they're brutal and match the tone of the music, but they just feel really standard for the style, and don't really feel like they fit in with a lot of the ideas that the band explore throughout its runtime. But those ideas and overall execution of said ideas are done well on a technical, sonic, and compositional aspect, as the music itself really speaks for itself, as it's this weird, progressive, and sci-fi death metal odyssey. The production on this album is clean and everything's really clear in the mix. Every nuance and idea can be heard, but it still remains very brutal, aggressive, and heavy. The complex and technical riffs all over this thing are great. I love the interesting structural elements that get worked into the tracks, and the more progressive and psychedelic passages are implemented very well. Every bit of instrumentation feels on point with this album. The songs really do speak for themselves, especially the 18-minute closer, which, yes, could have been done a little better, but for what it's worth, I really fucking love it. You know, I like pretty much every track in this album. I love this album in particular. It's a really ambitious and progressive venture to behold from a newer band, and if you haven't already, I'd absolutely recommend it. I'm so glad I got to check it out, because for years now, I've seen this album cover since, like, I only started properly getting into reviewing music, and it just looks so fucking cool. I will agree. It's such an amazing album cover. And I'm just thinking to myself, when am I going to listen to this? Like, I should be listening to this soon enough, like, because this thing looks cool. Mm. And now that I've got to listen to it, totally matches the fucking cover. The music is fucking phenomenal, honestly. Well, phenomenal. Actually, phenomenal is a bit of a strong word there. I think it's great. I really love what I'm hearing on this thing. The second track in particular, I fucking adore. I really, out of every single one on this list, I actually want to get this one on vinyl first, because the cover is just incredible. It looks so good. And it's an ambitious venture from a newer band, and if you haven't, I would absolutely recommend that you listen to it. My favorite tracks from Hidden History of the Human Race are Slave Species of the Gods, The Giza Power Plant, Inner Paths to Outer Space, and Awakening from the Dream of Existence to the Multidimensional Nature of Our Reality, Mirror of the Soul. I have no least favorite tracks.
Yeah, same.
Yep. And yeah, with that in mind, we did it. We talked about the death metal essentials. This was fucking huge, dude. Yeah. I'm glad we got to do this one.
Yeah,
and
that was fun.
Yeah, it was. And of course, thank you guys so much for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. We really hope you enjoyed. We really hope that you get to check out some of these death metal records, because they're absolutely worth it if you want to get into death metal. Obviously, check out records like the aforementioned Symbolic by Death. Listen to Altars of Madness from Morbid Angel. If you want to get into a bit of weirder shit, then get into Gorgotz and maybe Hidden History of the Human Race. And yeah, just let us know what you think of this list. Is there any albums we missed? Anything like that? And yeah, with that in mind, necessary links will be in the description to our own socials, to the Cassette Tapes Twitter, to our own YouTube channels, to all of that. And of course, be sure to check out the Death Worst Best that we did with Robert Walton from the Metal Meltdown. And be sure to check out some of the interviews we did with Tony Whitburn and Rough Criminal. So with that in mind, my name's been MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
See ya.
Peace and love. Peace and love.